This is a notice for all participants. This is a public meeting and proceedings are being webcast live online. A recording will also be available for playback on the Council's website shortly afterwards. Please note that your name will appear in the live stream and in the recording. Should you not wish for your image to appear on these, please turn off your camera. Third parties should not record or film the local plan hearing sessions, and neither the Council nor the Planning Inspectorate are liable for any third-party recordings. Thank you.
Okay, good morning, everybody. It's 9:30, so time for me to resume the hearing sessions as part of the examination of the Tunbridge Wells local plan. I've tested previously camera and microphones. Hopefully you can all see and hear me okay. Yeah, very good. Excellent. Well, welcome back for those of you who have attended previous sessions, and welcome along for those of you who haven't attended any of the sessions thus far. My name is Matthew Birkinshaw, Chartered Town Planner and the Inspector appointed by the Secretary of State to hold the examination. Charlotte Glancy, the Programme Officer, is here with us today, so I'll just ask Charlotte to very quickly turn her camera on so you can quickly say hello. Charlotte, as you know, is the Programme Officer for the examination, so if anybody does have any questions or queries regarding attending sessions, documents, statements, or anything to do with the administrative arrangements of the examination, please let Charlotte know. Her contact details are on the website and she's here today. Charlotte, was there anything from yourself before we get going?
No, I don't have anything. No.
Okay, thank you very much. So as people will be aware, this week we're meant to be sitting in the council offices as we have been doing for previous weeks. But due to a positive COVID test within the council's team, we've taken a decision to move the sessions online. So this is the third day of those sessions. We started on Tuesday with Jubilee Village, and yesterday we discussed the Paddock Wood and East Capel strategic site. Technology seems to be working fine. We haven't had any problems as far as I'm aware. I'll very quickly run through some housekeeping matters. I know this is sort of repetition for those who have been here before, who have used maybe Zoom meetings before, but just appreciate that there might be people here today who haven't participated in any of these events before. So I'll very quickly run through how it works. So the hearing sessions, as per the other sessions, are sort of structured discussions led by myself. It's not like an inquiry. There's no cross-examination of witnesses or detailed presentation of evidence. Structured discussions led by myself. So today we are using the Matters, Issues and Questions document, and we're working through the questions there. I will probably start by asking some questions of the council and exploring some of the soundness issues around some of the housing policies today, and I will then open it up to discussion from participants. So when you would like to speak, please use the raise hand function. Now, this could be in one of two places. For me, along the bottom, I've got various buttons: participants, chat, share screen, etc. And if I click on reactions, then there's a bar there to raise my hand. So I can raise it like that and then lower the hand again. So as and when people want to speak, if you could raise your hand, that lets me know that you want to participate. I'll then come to you. And then at that stage, if you can unmute your microphone and put your camera on. The first time you speak, if you could introduce yourself as well. We won't go around the virtual room as we did do in the council offices, but the first time you speak, if you could just turn your camera on, let me know who you are, whether you're acting on behalf of a particular client, landowner, and what your interest in today's session is. That would be much appreciated. Technology seems to be working fine. Fingers crossed. We've had a couple of participants with sound issues, but they tend to have been resolved. I think the issues have arisen where more than one person has been in the room on different laptops, and there's a bit of feedback. So that might be something to bear in mind for participants for today's session and others. And very quickly, I would just say, I've said it every morning, these hearings are an opportunity to allow representatives to put their points forward and make their representations. But we'll just say more than happy for people to participate in the discussion. But we don't need to hear the same points over and over again if other people have raised the points that you want to raise. And also, please do stick to the points that you've raised in your representations. So by all means, get involved in the discussion, get involved in the debate, but only insofar as it relates to the policies and representations that you've made. So that was a sort of quick canter through. So I know that obviously we're sort of quite far into the hearing sessions now, and a note from the participant list that several of you have been here before, either in the offices or online. So before we get going, any housekeeping matters arising from the council?
No, thank you very much, sir.
Excellent. Okay. Just bear with me 1 second while I bring the relevant documents up. Okay, so today we're moving on to, we've looked at the strategic sites, and the remainder of the sessions after today will be starting to look at the other residential site allocations. But today we're looking at the housing needs policies. So looking at housing mix, housing density, etc. What I would just say, and Charlotte, correct me if I'm wrong, this afternoon's session is a separate login, it's a separate session. So I think although the participants are probably quite similar, if not the same, when we come to lunch, leave this session, log out of this session, and then this afternoon, log back into the session. So there's a separate link for this afternoon session. So at break times, we'll have a morning sort of tea and coffee break. Don't log out, just turn cameras off, microphones off. But when we stop for lunch, log out, and then there's a separate login for this afternoon session. Again, any queries, please let Charlotte know. Issue 1 then, so we're under matter 8, which is meeting housing needs. This morning we're going to be looking at some of the housing policies in the local plan. And the first one is H1, which is to do with the housing mix. And I asked, is it sufficiently clear to decision makers, developers and local communities what is required of applications for planning permission under policy H1? And within the council's matter statement, they've referred to various evidence-based documents which sets out, with the type of mix of housing that's required in terms of family housing, 1-2 bedroom housing, etc. So the question really for the council is, do you think the policy is sufficiently clear, and is there a reason why the policy isn't more prescriptive in saying we need X number of 1-bed, 2-bed, 3-bed houses, and if you do think it's sufficiently clear, presumably then that you don't think any modifications would be required for effectiveness. So really, do you think policy H1 is submitted? Do you think it's going to work? Do you think it's sufficiently clear to be effective in terms of what developers actually need to provide?
So I'll ask Mr. Marlowe to proceed on behalf of the council.
Thank you. Good morning, sir. Yes, David Marlowe. I think, as you've mentioned in our hearing statement, there is an amount of evidence relating to need in terms of sizes of dwellings, but this is not definitive, and the council doesn't think it is appropriate to be prescriptive. Circumstances will vary by location and context, really. So therefore, the council thinks it is most appropriate to put the policy as it is in terms of an appropriate mix. I think it is important to have a mix with a range of sizes, types and tenures, as the policy says, but the detail of that will vary according to the circumstances of the proposal, and therefore while making due reference to that evidence, and indeed there may be further evidence that comes forward during the life of the plan, thinking about neighbourhood plans or supporting work such as parish housing surveys, then it's right to have regard to that in the development management process, and the policy refers to that. We do mention the supporting policy, the supporting evidence in the text, and we've suggested at paragraph 9 of the hearing statement that the strategic housing market assessment, SHMA, should also be referred to as part of that evidence base, because it may well be drawn on. Thank you.
So within the SHMA, and that's the Strategic Housing Market Assessment then, so I think just from my notes that made reference to sort of greater demand for sort of smaller 2 and 3 bedroom family housing, is that right, on the whole?
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
But
so
in contrast, sorry,
go on.
So I was just going to say that the previous paragraph 4, we highlight the housing needs study that looks at sort of demand, which is more for the 3 or 4 bed houses. So there's a sort of a need and demand question there. And of course, I think one of the other things that comes into play more recently is just thinking about what the impacts are of perhaps more home working as well comes into play. So I think that the council's of the view that being unduly prescriptive isn't appropriate at the moment, but to have regard to what the SHMA says by referencing it in the text is the appropriate way forward.
And so that's where you've suggested a change to the policy or the change to the supporting text?
To the supporting text, yes, sir.
Okay, let's take some views then. If anybody's made any representations on this, do people think policy H1 is going to work? Do you think it's effective? Is it clear enough? Does it need to be more prescriptive? Anybody, any views on this? No. I think you're probably right in terms of the suggested change. I think it would be useful within the supporting text for effectiveness to refer to these relevant documents, because as submitted, the plan just says, informed by intelligence on local housing needs and demand. So I think it could, in the supporting text, refer to clearly, obviously, the SHMA and your housing needs study. But I think if the council's position is going to be that, yes, this can be informed by the SHMA, but it sounds like the council's position is going to be, but it may also be informed by, another piece of evidence, or another piece of work, then it also just needs to reflect that clearly it's got to be evidence-based, I think is what you're saying. The SHMA and the housing needs assessments are clearly part of that process, but there may be another document that comes forward in the future, maybe a parish level document or a more area specific document that's relevant. So yeah, I probably agree that the policy, well, it'd be through the supporting text. It'd still be a main modification to amend the supporting text just to make it clear exactly what you mean by relevant evidence-based documents. Yeah. Okay. Bear with me one second. So moving on then, similar sort of question with the next policy, H2 on density we'll look at next. Again, do you think, again, that's clear and effective as to what the council is seeking to provide or require?
Yes, sir. Thank you. I'll deal with this again. I think the council's thought long and hard about this, and it finds itself with a fairly brief policy on densities. Again, not being prescriptive, and this I think largely stems from sort of development management experience. In terms of the regard to setting. Context is everything, as they say. But I think this is within the context of the policy setting out very clearly that development should make efficient use of land as the starting point with regard to the context. And we set out what tend to be the key considerations as regards the character, landscape setting, topography, and other factors that influence the appropriate density. So I think that is the appropriate way forward. Having regard to the NPPF, we do emphasise the efficient use of land, and I'd also draw attention to the supporting text, within it, in terms of the the concern that proposals that don't make efficient use of land would expect to be refused, particularly on central in central locations. So I think that is the the council's view, is that is the appropriate way forward on this matter.
Did the council consider the use of minimum density standards then? The framework, I think it's paragraph 125 talks about this, doesn't it? Use of minimum density standards. Was this something that the council looked at? Obviously, we've heard a bit already from participants, and you can see a couple of hands up already about really seeking to maximise densities in accessible urban areas. Is this something the council considered, looked at, discounted? How did you get there?
Yes, sir. It was certainly considered, and across the board, and as you say, particularly in central areas. But as we set out in the statement, that the context varies even within our town centres. Sort of ranging from Royal Tunbridge Wells, to Cranbrook. Very different contexts and different densities would be appropriate within those settings. And I'd suggest that with the conservation area at Cranbrook, the situation would vary. But by site as well. So yes, it has been considered, but it was deemed really that it wouldn't be appropriate to set a specific level, but that officers in development management look at the sites in the policy context, as I say, of looking to make efficient use of land as a starting point. On each particular location.
And if you were faced with that application, then let's say a windfall site, or even potentially an allocation that came forward, and this links back to the previous policy, say H1 as well, and some of the sort of criticisms and concerns that have been raised by participants. Let's say you got that development that came forward, and it was low density, larger dwellings. How would you as an authority say, well, hang on, no, this isn't appropriate, this isn't what we're seeking? How do you think the plan would work? How would you sort of be able to go back to a developer in that situation and robustly say, no, this isn't making the efficient use of land? Would it just be a judgment, or how would you quantify those concerns in that case?
In essence, so what would be the benchmark, I suppose, is the question. And I think, as I say, it will very much sort of depend on the context. If it was clearly low density, and of course there is also policy EN1 in relation to design standards. So that would come into play, and officers, as you say, would make a judgment based on that. But clearly, if it was a particularly low density in a more central location, then it would, and it was unjustified. I think it's important, unjustified by its by the character of the area and its local context. If it was unjustified by that, then then I think through the development management process, the officers would look at saying, well, this is not an efficient use of land. It isn't justified by the particular circumstances of the site. And I think that's really how it does and would work in practice.
Okay, let's take some views on this then. We'll go to Julie Davis.
So I'm just trying to get my video to start. Oh, there I am. Thank you. It's Julie Davis from CPRE Kent, the Countryside Charity. So I would just like to start off by saying that I don't think this policy complies with national policy. As the inspector has already said, paragraph 125 is really clear that the plans should contain policies to optimise the use of land, and that will be tested robustly as being done today. It then goes on to say that there should be minimum standards, density standards set for town and city centre locations and other locations well served by public transport. And it goes on to say that there should be, the council should be able to demonstrate that it's been, I'm paraphrasing, an uplift in the average density of those areas. And I just don't see that that's happening. I just feel that if you're a developer or an interested resident, where is, as Mr. Marlowe said, the benchmark? And it's just not sufficiently clear. The concentration seems to have been given consideration to density standards in central areas, but of course, paragraph 125B says the use of minimum densities should be used for other parts of the plan area. It should be a cross-plan policy. And my concern is, as Mr. Marlowe has said, that context is everything. So in that balance between making efficient use of land and having regard to the special character of the whole of the borough, whether that's the character of that particular street, the conservation area, the AONB, the setting of the AONB, the green belt, I just see there's a mismatch. And my concern is that if you are making that difficult decision to release greenbelt for housing development, to release it AONB land for housing development, that sufficient use should be made of that. And if you're then saying that you want to have perhaps a lower density as needed in the interest of the context of those sites, it kind of brings me back to a circular loop to the discussions and the issues we made when we met live a couple of weeks ago. That if you're going to allow lower density developments in respect of the context of the AONB and the Greenbelt, that presumably your housing requirement should be set lower than the housing need, following on from the advice in the NPPF at paragraph 11B. I accept that you might not agree with those points, but I do think that you need to be setting out the minimum standards for guidance. And the only guidance I've seen, unfortunately I wasn't here for the Chudley days, but I know that the council has submitted an additional paper on densities. And I don't know, you've spoken about Chudley. If you just allow me one sentence about Chudley, that it says it's 30 dwellings per hectare. And I have great difficulty, as you know, from our representations, our previous statements at length, that 30 dwellings per hectare is really, really low for a new settlement, a new village. Are we calling it a new town? And I don't think that's acceptable when you're making that very difficult decision to release greenbelt land and AONB land, any greenfield site in the countryside, that it should be at a density in order that the plan does actually yield what you want it to yield, and you don't end up with a situation where perhaps the densities are given, the actual built development is at an even lower density perhaps than the ones that we can glean by looking at the evidence base, in other locations. So I'm going to end up repeating myself, so I think I'll probably stop there. And of course, you're well aware of the length of time and the nature of our huge concern on the density issue.
Okay, thank you. Go to Town Forum. Sorry, I can't see the person's name.
Thank you, sir. Good morning. Mark Booker, representing the Town Forum, which represents some 50 plus organisations, residents associations, local interest groups in the town of Royal Tunbridge Wells. So I will limit myself to comments that are relevant to Royal Tunbridge Wells. Very strongly support what we've just heard from CPRE, from Julie. I've looked at the response that the council have made to your request for further information about specific densities. And the first point I would make is that the approach of the council to defining what is a suburb or an outer suburb or in a urban area doesn't seem at all appropriate to us. Taking the issues which were of particular concern to Julie Davies, we have here in Tunbridge Wells 2 greenbelt sites at Canewood Farm and at Spratsbrook Farm. Now these, according to the document that's been submitted to you, sir, they are classified as being in the outer suburb range. And yet both of these sites are actually within 1.5 miles of the town hall of Royal Tunbridge Wells. We think that the approach being taken to density is wholly inappropriate in the context of a town like Royal Tunbridge Wells, and that the density within the inner urban area is too low as a starting point, and then that gets transferred out as you go to what somebody might think is a site that's 5 miles away from the centre point of Royal Tunbridge Wells, but in fact is almost within walking distance. So we end up with a proposed density of 23 or 24 dwellings per hectare for these proposed incursions into the greenbelt, quite apart from whether there are exceptional circumstances, which we'll look at tomorrow. The issue arises of whether that kind of density is in any remote sense appropriate. And our argument would be that no, it isn't. If you were minded to confirm the removal of those 2 sites from greenbelt, then really following on from Julie Davies's arguments based on the NPPF, we think you have to radically review the kind of densities proposed. I suspect that this applies probably across the board, but as I said, sir, we're only confining ourselves to matters which we know about in the town of Royal Tunbridge Wells. Thank you, sir.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Booker. So going back to the framework then, framework's quite clear. Says where there is an existing or anticipated shortage of land for meeting identified housing needs, it is especially important that planning policies and decisions avoid homes being built at low densities and ensure that developments make optimal use of the potential of each site. So that to me seems quite clear. I'm struggling, I think, to understand how the council would actually achieve this. Yes, there needs to be a consideration of, clearly, conservation areas, for example, preserve our hands, character and appearance. Those things are pretty obvious. AONB, local character, these things are all clear. I'm just struggling to understand how the councils are really going to ensure that land does actually make an efficient and effective use of the proposals, make an efficient and effective use of land. And if that developer comes forward with the scheme of whatever it may be, 20, 25 dwellings per hectare, how would the decision maker or how would the council's development management team say, no, we need to be, this whole sort of 8 days of hearings, we've been hearing a lot from the council about, how it sort of looked at lots of parcels of land and really sort of exhausted opportunities for new development. So if that's the case, how is the council going to really sort of maximise density and really maximise the efficient use of these sites coming forward?
I think so. Just to deal with the NPPF point, don't rely on this, but of course it is in the context of where you're not meeting. I read that sort of you're not meeting your housing needs. But in any event, as I say, the minimum density standards, you will understand, I think, to be specific on those in the different contexts, it wouldn't necessarily, or indeed likely, be reflecting the particular context of each site. As I say, the policy sets out the principle. we do give in the information we provided on density, as you say, although people might challenge it, I think the edge of settlement sites would be outer suburb, and we do have the National Design Code density ranges, and indeed it is the council's intention to produce a local design guide and code in due course, which can provide additional information guidance around that. But I would still come back to the principle is there, and the application of that, rather than it's there's no real evidence to say this is an appropriate density or range of densities for these locations. And may well get into arguments about, as we already have, what an area actually is. I think it's far better that the council, and you'll see from the densities it's put forward, they are within broadly the ranges anticipated in the National Design Code in any event, and we are looking, certainly you'll see, at higher densities in the centres. That is what the council is doing. So I think the further detail and the application of that through this policy H2, policy EN1, and future design coding is the appropriate way forward.
So I wonder if I might just add something here. We're going to go through each of the site allocations in due course, and I'm sure one of the issues you'll be keen to explore is whether or not the number of houses or the range of or the range allocated for a particular site is appropriate in regard to its capacity and context. So far as allocations are concerned, those will be tested, and we will understand whether or not they make efficient use of land, of the land allocated. So to that extent, the requirements of the NPPF will be tested through the examination of the individual allocations. The question then is whether or not there is sufficient control within the policy to deal with applications in relation to sites which are not allocated when they come forward in the future, and that is the issue. What I'm going to suggest is this, because I'm mindful of the rationale of the observations being made, is that once we have gone through the process of looking at these individual sites and having had regard to the context of the sites and also the disposition of sites over the borough or within the borough, we might be able to make some kind of assessment of appropriate densities in certain types of area, and to see whether or not, having regard to that, it will be appropriate to introduce density thresholds in the policy in order to assist applicants and the council in the future in relation to proposals for residential development on unallocated sites should they come forward.
I appreciate that the council is faced with a borough that has various land use constraints, conservation areas, etc., etc. For me, the framework is quite clear around plans should contain policies to optimise the use of land, meet as much development by needs housing as possible, should include use minimum density standards for city and town centres and other locations that are well served by public transport. These standards should seek a significant uplift in the average density of residential development, unless it can be shown that there are strong reasons why this would be inappropriate. So I think, yes. I think it's that real emphasis on accessible and sustainable locations, you know, the framework's pretty clear there that, you know, town city centres, accessible locations really should be driving and seeking to maximise density standards. Now it may well be, and it may well be the case that that's what the council is doing as we go through, especially when we look at some of the you know, some of the sites around Royal Tunbridge Wells, for example.
Yes.
But I just wonder, I don't have the wording in my head at the moment, but I just wonder whether policy H2 could just be made more explicitly clear that if you're in a town city centre context, you know, accessible location, that the requirement is about you know, really pushing and seeking to maximise densities, especially given the context of this borough, especially given the context we've heard, you know, Greenbelt AONB constraints. If you're within you know, an inset settlement and it's a sustainable location, then the emphasis should really be on maximising the efficient use of land.
And I fully see the sense of that. So what I'm suggesting is once we're in a position to have assessed through the examination the appropriateness of the proposed densities for the various allocations, we can look back over those which relate to city centres in the way you've just described, and look at what kind of densities are being achieved there. If the allocations are appropriate, and the densities in those allocations are appropriate, then we can use that as some kind of benchmark, as it were, for the policy itself, if you think it's necessary to include a minimum density for those types of areas.
Mr. Marlowe?
Yes, I think your suggestion was really an adjunct to the existing housing density policy, to say that within central and accessible locations, we should be looking to maximise density, essentially, which, you know, the council would have no issue with. I think that is its approach. It's just a question of whether you know, we're sort of into the realms then of duplicating what's in the NPPF. But as an approach, I think that's where the council is at. So if that's what you had in mind, rather than specific densities, which we still have concerns about as well, because of the importance of the context, then, you know, that's just, you know, that's something that we can consider as well.
Yeah, it's difficult, isn't it? Because every site will be different in its own context. Whether you give some consideration to ranges, perhaps, I don't know. But I think the way the policy is written, I mean, well, I mean, the supporting text is the context of the policy. It starts by the density of residential development should have regard to the character of the area, including landscape. It's almost as if the emphasis is the wrong way around. Is this emphasis is about density is just informed by character. And I think actually, given the context of the borough and what the NPPF is saying, is actually no, density needs to be informed by town centres, accessible locations, really pushing densities, because you're surrounded by Greenbelt, you're surrounded by AONB. So, you know, future plan reviews further down the line, you're effectively going to be in the same position of needing to look at the Greenbelt, needing to look at AONB, etc. So this is an opportunity to, where you do get those windfall sites in and around accessible locations, is saying, no, we really want to push densities in order to meet housing needs. But yeah, clearly, if you've got a site that's, you know, within or adjacent to a conservation area, then there are other, you know, policy requirements that sort of are pulling in different directions, and that will always be the case. But I think as a sort of overarching policy theme, it should be really sort of about pushing and maximising densities in accessible locations. We'll go to Mr. Chapman, please. Not heard from Mr. Chapman.
Sorry, thank you there. Just get all this up now. Okay, yeah, hi, I'm James Chapman, JAC Planning. I'm an independent planning consultant, and I put together developments from scratch for landowners and small developers throughout Kent. So I think my observation here is that I don't see that there is a particular barrier to putting minimum densities in locations. I think we've got the immediate available information that shows us village boundaries and town boundaries and the number of dwellings within those. So we already have a benchmark there of what the prevailing density currently is. Sort of the other comments here as well about making most efficient use of land. I think that's it's an important factor we need to be looking at. And I agree with the inspector here that density is the first thing we should be looking at. The other parts of the policy that then set out prevailing character, etc., can then be taken into consideration to be the exception on individual cases if so required. But it strikes me that there's already calculations being carried out by the local authority on the allocated sites, as Paul has pointed out, and that also could be a benchmark starting position for each individual location. So I think that the work's already been done largely to be able to get numbers on a page, and it was interesting, hearing about Cranbrook being an example here, because I looked at a site in Cranbrook with Tunbridge Wells. It was refused, and that's not a problem. But we had no particular guidance to look at there. It was within the conservation area, adjacent to the conservation area, and it was a building on a large plot. Now, the prevailing character of that area was buildings on large plots. We went in with 4 units, and it was refused for other reasons. But the town council wanted 9 units. So, as a developer, I think the more prescriptive you can be with planning policies, the easier it becomes for applicants to review those. And I didn't speak on the sort of first policy, perhaps a bit of nerves because I've never spoken at a local plan before. But I noted on that as well. My comment refers to the NPPF and paragraph 61 on that. The size, type, and tenure of housing for different groups in the community should be reflected in planning policies. And I just wonder whether that is prescriptive enough. I think the more prescriptive we can be in planning policy, the better chance we've got of achieving what the policies are setting out for. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, certainly don't be nervous about speaking at local plan examinations. Inspectors are all a friendly bunch. Go to Ms. Davis next.
Thank you for that. So I welcome the council's suggestion that the policy be amended and that you're looking at the sites as they come through on the following days and looking at how they're classified in terms of being central or suburban and whatever. But again, coming back to the view that this should have been done earlier on in the process, because it may well be that you are persuaded by the views of local residents and interest groups about the sustainability of their particular sites. They know their local locations really well. And of course, this is something that's already been gone through with the Sheila, that the council has gone through and assessed all the sites that were submitted. It's picked the best of the best. It's picked the most sustainable sites, with Tudley, the site that can be made sustainable. And if the yields are going to go up because the density is going to go up because you've allocated the best sites possible in terms of a whole range of factors, it then calls into question that are you allocating too much of this precious greenbelt and AONB land? Thank you.
Okay, I think we'll look at the sites as we go through in their own context. I think insofar as H2 works for windfall sites, I need to give some thought as to whether or not it how prescriptive it needs to be, but I think it's just laying down a marker. I think it certainly, as a minimum, needs to change the emphasis. And I think that was the point that Mr. Chapman was saying. The emphasis needs to be on maximising the efficient use of land, and this point about character, etc. Yes, clearly important considerations, but I just think the policy is the wrong way around. It just needs to be emphasising the real efficient use of land and really seeking to maximise densities in locations which are accessible and sustainable, and that just echoes with what the NPPF says and would bring the policy in line with the NPPF. So I think as a minimum it needs to do that. I need to give some consideration as to whether you then need to start setting minimum densities, taking into account what people have said, but also what the council have said about the different, locations and context of the borough.
Yeah, I think as we go through the sites and explore those sites, and let it provide us with, a better understanding as to whether or not setting minimum densities would be appropriate.
Yeah, I think you're right, and I think that exercise will probably. Obviously, the council have said, we've got such a wide variety of different contexts and different sites. And I think that would, once we get to the end of that, we might think, well, actually, yeah, that would be tricky. Or actually, no, there is a general consensus here that you can be pushing densities and setting minimum standards. So, yeah, I think you're right. Okay, we will move on. Next on the list, I think we get to affordable housing. And there's some representations around the table for affordable housing. We touched on this slightly already, but just by way of introduction to this policy, then it might be worthwhile the council just setting out what the affordable housing requirements are in terms of the percentages and what they are based on, please.
So I'm going to ask Mr. Gardner to address this.
I suspect, sorry, Paul, I suspect Mr. Gardner will be expecting me to kick off and him to come in.
I apologise, Mr.
Just
Gardner.
on the policy.
Yes, of course.
If I just explain the policy to start with, and Mr. Gardner can come in. I think, in essence, the policy is, and we've talked already about the high level of affordable housing need in the borough, and therefore the need to essentially maximise what can be achieved in terms of affordable housing. And the policy has done this, and it's based on viability assessments of different options in terms of the requirements, and that's come out as identifying that 40% affordable housing requirement in relation to greenfield sites and 30% in relation to brownfield sites is achievable in the borough on the basis of the other elements of the policy, particularly the fact that the council is looking towards a 60% rented, social rented in most cases, and 40% intermediate, essentially other tenures within affordable housing definition on its sites. It's also looking, I should add, at the potential allowed for under the NPPF for contributions from smaller sites within designated landscapes. And you'll be aware that a large part of the borough is within the High Weald area of outstanding natural beauty, which is of course within that definition. And but again on viability grounds, it's looking for that to be equivalent to 20% of the number of dwellings on the site. The policy also looks at other aspects in terms of a local connection, again bearing in mind the level of local housing need, and deals with the delivery as well of the sites, and also in relation to the design and layout in terms of particularly in terms of the distribution of affordable housing within schemes. It also covers the building standards for affordable housing, although I think that we'll probably discuss that more fully under policy 8.6 this afternoon. Justin, is there anything you wanted to add in terms of the sort of the background and justification for the policy, particularly in terms of perhaps the tenure split?
Good morning, Justin Gardner. So it's the first time I've spoken today. Prepared various evidence-based documents over years for the council, either on my own, excuse me, which is the most recent assessment of affordable need, which is CD 3.76, and previously pieces of work with Iceni projects and formerly Geo Hearn. I mean, just in terms of the evidence of need, that latest piece of work identified quite a substantial need for rented affordable housing, particularly social rented housing, estimated at 323 units a year if all needs were to be met, and also considered affordable home ownership. That report identified there's quite a number of households whose income levels essentially fit them in a gap between being able to rent privately but not buy a home locally, although we couldn't fully quantify the need because there's some difficulty around the fact that there is a supply of lower quartile housing to buy. So we identified that there's a need for both rented affordable housing and a number of households who potentially could afford an affordable home ownership product. In terms of the 60-40 split, I think that may well in part have been driven by viability, although my latest, the CD 3.76 report, and I'd have to bring up the paragraph number if you wanted it, did identify that if we effectively assumed that around about half the supply of lower quartile homes to buy could be counted towards the supply, then you'd be looking at a tenure split of around 64-36. So the evidence is consistent with the policy, although I think the policy to some extent has been driven by earlier needs assessments and probably the viability evidence.
Just in terms of the differences then between brownfield, greenfield, so that's purely based on viability and presumably greater costs associated with brownfield sites. So part one of the policy, sites comprising mostly greenfield land, 40%. Then it says sites comprising over half brownfield land. Is there a reason why that's worded slightly differently? As you said, most of greenfield sites 40%, but then you've got this sort of half brownfield land test. Where's that come from? What's that based on?
I think simply, sir, it is based on a discussion about if it's exactly 50-50, what do we ask for? So it's an issue of just being clear as to the what would be required in that context. It's essentially that. But yes, you're quite right in terms of, it was viability as that has driven the lower requirement in the for brownfield land. And yes, that's evidenced in the Dixon Searle Stage 1 report.
Yeah. And we talked in previous sessions, didn't we, about the plan setting out the need for affordable housing? The previous sessions, yeah, do you remember that? Yeah, that was a previous modification that we talked about.
Yes, sir, and the council will put that forward as part of its sort of, sort of package of proposed modifications. So, yeah. Sorry, I should have. Sorry,
yeah, I lost you there. But yeah, no, we talked about that at previous sessions. Yeah, that's absolutely fine. So just before we get into some of the,
we'll put that forward.
Yeah, just before we get into some of the detail on this, let's just seek any views and representations just on a sort of higher level basis of the thresholds and the requirements at 30% and 40%, just in case anybody's got any representation. See, Mr. Booker, you've got your hand up.
Picture. Thank you, sir. clearly this is a matter which is highly commercial, but is also rather undesirable in our view, in that in terms of need rather than supply, you can argue that probably most brownfield sites are going to be of the highest order of sustainability, and that those sites are precisely the places where people who require social housing can get most benefit from living close to railway stations, bus routes, retail areas, and so forth. So the apparent commercial problems of developing those brownfield sites seems to be in conflict with the requirement to meet need. Obviously, I'm in no way any expert on any of this, but it's just something that occurred to us as being rather unfortunate as a consequence if that goes into a local plan. Thank you, sir.
Miss Ashton.
Good morning, sir. Judith Ashton on behalf of Redborough and Persimmon, who have interest on land east of Paddock Wood. Really, the only reason I wanted to comment today, sir, was because of some of the comments that have been made before about the issue of affordable housing provision and what is being proposed in and around Paddock Wood, and this issue of 40%. As I said in my reps on, I think it was matter 5, the Dixon Searle viability appraisal is quite clear. And if you look at CD 3.65, table 6, and also at para 3.2.11 on page 23 of that document, only 2 out of the 8 viability appraisals come out positively with 40% affordable housing. Paragraph 3.2.11 makes it clear that there are reasonable prospects of delivery on the council's emerging local plan policies. And in addition to that, paragraph 22 of the same document makes it clear that the strategic sites will likely require ongoing development and require a review of a wide range of matters leading up to their delivery as the details of the proposals build, including potential further consideration of viability. Whilst paragraph 17 of that document also refers to the fact that with a functioning property and development market in place, the policy area that has most impact on development viability is that of affordable housing. And I just want to flag the point that whilst we are looking at 40% affordable housing on these sites at present, clearly there are viability issues at play. There are major strategic works involved with the development of those sites. And therefore there does need to be a reference between the strategic sites policies and policy H3, which does provide for a variation in the 40% in exceptional circumstances. I know it's drafted as that at the moment, but you have had representations before you suggesting that that should be changed. And that's why I wanted to say something, because I think it is very important that there is the opportunity to change that or provide for variation across the different phases, because again, the strategic sites are long build programmes, they're delivering a lot of housing and matters will change, hence the discussions we've had about flexibility within the policies over the last few days. Thank you.
So how would you, what would your suggestion be to change the plan then? The change in H3 or the change in the strategic site policies themselves?
At the moment, the strategic sites policy does actually cross-refer to policy H3, and policy H3 does provide for a variation in the requirement in exceptional circumstances. We support that position. The reason I'm speaking is because others have suggested otherwise, and I just wanted to make clear why we support that position, given the situation as it currently stands.
Yeah, and we've already talked about changes to the strategic sites to look at for phasing plans, implementation plans as well. And yeah, presumably, you know, we're all aware that these strategic sites, can we see them again? big sites going to come forward over many years. Well, some of them even beyond the plan period, so clearly the changing circumstances.
Precisely, which is why that flexibility needs to be provided, because the infrastructure costs are significant, and as the Dixon Cell viability appraisal accepts, there needs to be an ongoing review of that. It's not a kind of one-off. It will be reviewed as we move forward, because things will change potentially. They might not change, but you know, there is the prospect of them changing, which is why that flexibility needs to be built in.
Mr. Hayes.
Thank you, sir. Troy Hayes on behalf of Paddockwood Town Council. Yeah, just wanted to point out in policy H3 paragraph 1, it says that there should be a minimum of 40% of the gross number of residential units on site. In terms of the Paddockwood strategic policy, there's a slight difference in wording, and it says that 40% affordable housing should be provided on site, in line with policy H3. So there's a slight difference between the two, H3 saying a minimum of, and the strategic policies saying 40% rather than a minimum of. So I think in terms of aligning the policies, the strategic policy on Paddockwood should also say a minimum of 40% if those policies are to be aligned.
I think that's probably okay. It's plans read as a whole. I think that the affordable housing requirement decision-making stage, it's clearly, it would be H3. And I think as long as the strategic sites cross-reference policy H3, I think when you're considering affordable housing, that's your go-to policy. So I'd be, it falls into the category of, is it unsound? Probably not. I think it's probably, you're going to get these, you know, minor discrepancies in wording. I'll leave it to the council to consider, but I think you look at the strategic site policies, they say you provide affordable housing in accordance with policy H3. So you go to H3, that's where it sets out the requirements. So, okay, points noted, but I'm not sure it's a soundness matter necessarily. Mr. Jones?
It's Gregory Jones, Queen's Council's first time speaking today, instructed by Provision Catherine Mills to my left, and on behalf of Cooper Strategic Land Limited. So just got 3 short points, well, 2 points if I could make, and then Catherine Mills would like to address you. So the first point is this, just really arising out of Miss Ashton's point, and I'll just deal with it very shortly. Unless we misunderstood, she was raising an issue about the viability of 40%, and all that we would say was that was really something for yesterday, and the question of very special circumstances. We're not entirely clear, but if it's being said that there's uncertainty on delivery of 40%, seem to be said over most, or if not some of the areas, that would then, where does that figure in the assessment by the council in their very special circumstances for releasing land into the green belt? But actually, in terms of housing, you won't get the 40% benefit. So that's just a point we just make in response to what was just raised then. But the 2 points we're going to make, I'll deal with one, Ms. Mills the other. Obviously, we're slightly coming at it from a very particular angle. So for your notes, sir, it's our answers to matter 8, issue 3, your question 1, sir. We obviously, our interest is extra care, elderly extra care, which we say is C3, but C2, sorry, no, C2. But when you look at the policy, we say, and this is the point, there's an attempt to either guide or define what is C2 and C3. We think the guidance is wrong, but we take a more in principle point. So we don't think it's a place for a development plan to seek to define or say what use comes within a use category. That's a matter of law, may involve fact and degree on a particular application, but that's something which is set by the Secretary of State in the use classes order, and it cannot be that a plan could alter what isn't and isn't C2 and C3, and that's important because, as you'll see, that's the trigger for coming into policy H3. And it's effectively our concluding point 410 for your note, is that we say, one, the policy shouldn't be doing it. It's unclear in any event, and we think unuseful and non-effective. But we say that that aspect that seeks to guide what is C2 and C3 should properly be deleted. So that's our point one. And then I just asked Ms. Miles to talk from a planning application point of the difficulties with it.
Just quickly to stop you there. There was a suggested modification by the council, I believe, in the hearing statement in response to that, and a suggested change, I think, in the plan. We're talking about here about paragraph 6.352, I think.
Yes, so you're correct.
And it talks there, and that's where it says Class C2, and then Class C3, and it lists extra care accommodation as Class C3, and yet we're all aware of the issues around that and how that crops up for the context of affordable housing, etc. The council suggested, I think, some wording that says it is acknowledged that extra care housing may be considered C2 depending on the level of care provided. Would that overcome your concerns in that regard?
Yeah, well, I'll leave it to Ms. Miles. She's jumped the gun and said no, but I'll let her explain, and if necessary, come back. But the answer is no, but Ms. Miles will elaborate.
I think so I'm right that modification was in the submission local plan at 6.352, because those words, it's acknowledged that extra care housing may be considered C2 depending on the level of care provided, are underlined in the policy there of the submission local plan. But no, the reason I say no, sir, is we'll come on to it when we look at the proposed site allocations and whether or not the sufficient sites allocated to meet the extra care need. And what you'll note there is that there are 2 sites which the council are relying on to meet their extra care needs. One of which is the former ABC Cinema site, which has only recently been introduced. That's been approved as a use class C3 development, but is being argued as extra care. And in that application, a viability case was necessary to justify that the development was not viable to provide affordable housing. So it was treated very much as a C3 residential dwelling application, but is now being argued as extra care. And also the sites are at Arriva bus depot on St John's Road. Again, that was approved as a C3 residential development. It's now being argued as being extra care. In that case, there's actually no mention of extra care in the report or in the planning obligations. But again, a viability case in that instance was necessary to demonstrate that affordable housing was not necessary. So I think that the council's attempt to try and define through its local plan what use class extra care falls into does create some confusion. So that when you're submitting an application, you're not sure how the council is then going to treat it and whether or not viability is then going to be necessary. And I think that the 2 bullet points at 6.352 could be deleted in their entirety, because what paragraph 6.2 starts with saying is that it's for the local planning authority to consider whether the development falls into a particular use. The plan doesn't need to then try and pigeonhole different uses into use classes. that's for the application to deal with. That's for pre-application discussions with the authority to look at the specific proposal that's on the table and whether or not it falls into C3 or C2.
When you read the supporting text, does it not suggest that each application will be assessed on its own merits, talks about a level of care, etc. So is it really I don't know. I read that. I don't see as that the supporting text is saying that extra care is C2 or C3. I think if you read the supporting text as a whole, does it not actually emphasize the point that you're making, i.e. that these things have to be considered on their own merits because it's down to what each scheme actually is going to do?
Yes, but so yeah, that's what 6.353 does seek to do. But then in practice, at application stage, it isn't actually the level of care that's provided that is determinative of whether or not a proposal falls into C3 or C2, because that's not something that the council on those two other applications is even looking at. Those two applications don't have any restrictions or in terms of care. There's no requirement to provide care in those two applications. So on the face of it, they are C3. Yeah. So it does create confusion, I think, in this policy, and then how that's carried forward in practice into application.
So can I just add as well, in terms of the text, text shouldn't be included on, we say on the basis it does no harm, although, so I'm going to go on to say that this supporting text does do harm. So my point of principle is that the policy shouldn't be seeking to change or influence what comes into the use classes order. And actually by picking out level of care as a factor, it's also sort of misdirecting on what is C3 and C2. So for example, a key issue is the fact that in extra care, which is not would not come within the residential use classes order, you have significant proportions of communal areas. Now that isn't something that is to do with level of care, but that's also a critical distinction between a proposal that would be ordinarily residential and trigger affordable housing, and something that is C3. So we say it should be deleted. I also raise this question: is a similar approach taken elsewhere to use classes in the plan or elsewhere, where supporting text is drafted as sort of supplementary, some form of supplementary MPPG to give guidance to what's in a use class? We suggest it's not appropriate per se, and secondly, what is being done is misleading for the reasons I just said and what examples Ms. Miles has given. So we don't think, unfortunately, it is a solution.
Okay, well, let's look at what the submitted plan says then. So what did the actual plan say? It talks about the two use classes. Thinking out loud then, solution to this, thinking out loud whether or not, so this is a question to the council then, whether or not you should just string down the text and just essentially say that it would be considered on its own merits. Which is effectively, I think, what you're getting at anyway. And I've put you on the spot there slightly, but
I'll give it some thoughts there, if I may. I'm trying to think this through. I'll give it some thought and perhaps take instructions a bit later on, if I may, on this.
Yeah, it's one of those. I appreciate the points that have been made. If I'm being honest, I do think that there's perhaps an unnecessary worry as to what this supporting text is saying. I think perhaps an easy, pragmatic way forward might be just to emphasise that these things are considered, on their own merits, taking into account various different things, isn't it? I appreciate the points that Ms. Miles has made about the difficulty of this supporting text is that you end up relying on it, but I don't share the concerns to the nth degree that the supporting text is going to be relied upon word for word. It's read as a whole. I think it's reasonably clear. I think the council probably just needs to have a bit of a pragmatic look at it, and might be just one of those occasions where less is more.
Yeah, okay. I'm happy to have a look at it. I share your view, but I don't think it causes any undue problems. But I'll have a look at it and see if we can slim it down a little bit. Leave it with me, and if necessary, I'll speak to my learned friend separately outside this to see if we can.
Yeah, I think that's probably sensible. If you want to speak with Ms. Miles, obviously they've got to, on their behalf, outside of the hearing, to just have a look at stripping some text out, and what can be a bit of a pragmatic way forward to move it forward. That'd be much appreciated. Okay, Mr. Chapman.
Yeah, hello again. Thank you, sir. I had sort of 3 points, but just sort of hearing the conversation on C2 and C3 and sort of looking at that, just a quick view on that personally. I've just completed a C2 development, and for my view here, we've got the different types of older persons housing set out at 6.351, and I do think 6.352 is confusing. The thing that I would say is it's grouping extra care accommodation with other types of older persons housing that don't provide care. So I think the distinction is actually very clear. I think C2 is a type of housing that provides care, which includes extra care. And, I think putting a definition that shows it in C3 is definitely confusing. And I can easily see that local authority planners will look at the policy and then interpret it as such. We've had enough on that. So sort of moving on to the other sort of points. I wonder if I might come back to a couple of points later, because I think you were trying to keep it to sort of headline info here. So my key point on that is on policy H3 paragraph 1. We've got the 40%, and it says where this percentage is not a whole number, it should be rounded up to the next whole number, which on the face of it doesn't seem too bad. But as I work with small developers all the time, it actually seems to polarize the effect on small developers disproportionately. And I've done the sums for us here. So an 11 unit scheme would require 5 affordable units, which is 45.5%. A 13 unit scheme, 46%, 46.2. A 16 unit scheme, 43.8. It's a small point, but I think we should be trying to encourage small developers to get out there. And while we're only talking about one unit here, it is disproportionately affecting them. And when you're sort of saying 45, 46%, those sites are going to struggle to come forward. It's putting more of an effect on them. So I'd like to see that changed somehow. Thank you.
Yeah, sometimes you get other plans where they end up with financial contributions for the differences, don't you? The 0.6 of a dwelling becomes a financial contribution. Is this something that the council's previously done, sort of rounding up? What's the current development plan do in this regard? It's something that generally has worked or has caused frustration and problems.
I can tell you that it's silent.
I think so. Sorry, did Mr. Chapman want to come in?
Sorry, yeah, I was just going to say the current development plan's silent on that, and it's caused problems before when talking about the levels, and that's why it's something that I was looking at in trying to formulate a policy going forward that doesn't have that disproportionate effect. Sorry, Mr. Marlowe there.
No, that's fine, and Mr. Chapman's right. It's not. It doesn't give any sort of amplification on it. But the council has considered that. I think, in fairness, he has made this point in his representations, and it is something that I think the council is sympathetic towards. And I think, in essence, that the policy really, the council would be happy for it to say that the percentage is not a whole number, it will be rounded to the nearest whole number, which will mean that in a sense perhaps there's less affordable housing from some small sites proportionately, but it takes the point that Mr. Chapman's making, and I'd be happy to make that amendment.
Is that not what it already does? If I misread that then, so where the percentage is not a whole number, we round it up to the next whole number.
It can be interpreted as if it's, for instance, as Mr. Chapman says, it's 4.1. It means you'd be obliged to provide 5 units, whereas yes, it is confusing. It should be just rounded to the nearest whole number.
So
next is
so in the case of the 4.1,
is ambiguous.
So in the case of the 4.1, it would be 4. But yeah, in the sort of converse of that 4.9, then you'd be providing 5. Is that what the council seeks to do?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Okay. Right. Okay. Yeah. Well. Yeah. Probably worthwhile just making that explicitly clear then.
Yes, we will as a modification. So yes.
Yeah. Sorry, Miss Marlowe, did you want to say anything further?
I think just to come back on a couple of points that were made earlier. Obviously, if I just take them in order, we took what the town forum said in relation to previously developed land and affordable housing. Forget we're still on affordable housing, aren't we? But obviously that's, it is important to manage the requirements for affordable housing to make sure we do get the previously developed land forward. That, as we've just been saying, is part of making efficient use of land. In terms of the sort of the 40% point, I think we would agree with yourselves. I think as Mr. Chadverian has said, we will look at the wording, particularly of 6332. I think the intention was that by specifying the sorry, not 6332, sorry, the 6352 and the previous one, we were looking to be helpful. Not everyone knows what C2 and C3 is, but we absolutely take the point that extra care, in our view, can be either C3 or C2. It's not necessarily, and we'll talk about this later in terms of the sort of the relationship with enhanced sheltered. But we do give an indication clearly, I think in 6.354 of what would be expected in terms of minimum care package, and it is, and has been said all on behalf of Provision, it's a matter of fact and degree, and that's the council's position. I should say that it has its viability assessment for extra care was done with affordable housing as part of it. So it's not ruled out on affordability grounds, but it may be when it comes to the details of specific proposals, as has been referred to.
Yeah, agree that obviously Mr. Sheridan's pointed out that I think it just has have a look at that supporting text, and might be the case of less is more, but appreciate why the council maybe sought to be helpful. Ms. Ashton.
Thank you, sir. Just quickly coming back on the point that Gregory Jones QC made about my submissions to you this morning, sir. The question actually asked for the justification for requiring 40% affordable housing. I was merely pointing out that part of that justification relates to what is in the viability appraisal, and the viability appraisal is very clear on what it says about the viability of the strategic sites, and that is why there needs to be a link between the strategic sites policy and policy H3. It's got nothing to do with exceptional circumstances. I'm not making an exceptional circumstances case. My client's site is not in the Greenbelt. We're merely pointing out the need for that linkage because of other representations where some have suggested to you that the strategic site should not be linked to policy H3, and you'll recollect those conversations in earlier hearings. Thank you.
Okay, any other comments just on sort of just looking at sort of headline figures and requirements of affordable housing, really? Okay, fine. So that was really question one. Question two was around paragraph 65 of the framework states that where major development involving provision of housing is proposed, planning policy should expect at least 10% of total number of homes to be available for home ownership. How this be secured? Obviously, seen the council's statement on that, so I didn't have any further questions, unless anybody else did at this stage. Equally around the justification for developments of 6 to 9 units, providing financial contributions in the high wheeled AOMB. Again, we've heard the council's justification. Just in terms of that, in terms of the financial contribution then, let me just go back to it. So the policy requires heights in the high wheeled area outside natural beauty delivering 6 to 9 dwellings will be expected to provide a financial contribution towards the provision of off-site affordable housing. I think I know what you're going to say, but just for the purpose of other people hearing, just why is that the case then? So why was that a financial contribution then rather than provision of on-site as other schemes may do?
Yes, sir. I suspect that's what Ms Davis was about to draw attention to as well. So hopefully I can sort of preempt that to a degree. I think in essence there are two reasons. The first is when we are talking about very small numbers here, and for viability reasons, so 20% is what Dixon and Searle have recommended, as much as we can reasonably expect. So we're literally talking of 1 or 2 units, and it's very difficult in practice for a registered provider to actually take on units of or that small number of schemes of affordable units within a development. It's simply a sort of a management issue. The other sort of reason that we were sort of mindful of is that never been actually rescinded when the provision for lower thresholds in designated landscapes was introduced. It was expressed in terms of a financial contribution, and that's also on our mind. I think also I'd add, just from a practical reason, I can see that there may be sort of tenures that could discount housing that could come forward on a single dwelling basis, but the greatest need, particularly in the area of outstanding natural beauty of those parts of the borough, is for affordable housing for rent. And the gaining financial contribution allows our housing team to essentially promote additional supply in the local area. When other schemes come forward, it can use the money to get extra units or sort of a more suitable sort of a rented tenure. So that's really the justification for getting the financial contributions rather than the on-site.
Ms Davis.
Thank you. You will have seen from our written statement, our hearing statement, that we've referred you to two CPRE research documents, Beauty Still Betrayed about the AONB, and also a report on why young people are leaving rural areas, and the evidence is that they're leaving it because they can't access affordable housing. So it is the point that probably Mr. Marlow thought I was going to be making, that we would prefer to see affordable housing provision made within the AONB in order that it serves those people in need in the AONB. And if these valuable AONB sites are to be lost, really it should be for the benefit of local people. Thank you.
So just on that point then, if a site came forward within the AONB, two questions actually. So if a site came forward within the AONB that was more than 9 units, so 10 and above, major developments, etc., what would be the requirement there? Would that still be the 40% requirement then?
I'm hoping you're directing that question to Mr. Marlow.
Yeah, sorry.
Hopefully we'll give the same answer. Yes, the answer is yes, it would be a 40% requirement, and of course perhaps allied to that is that there would be a local connection, so a cascade in that context. In terms of financial contributions, the same really in practice would apply, that we would look to spend it in the parish or a neighbouring parish, and then sort of cascading outwards. That's sort of dealt with in the effectively it's sort of dealt with outside of the local plan as it's a housing matter, and the housing department sort of is sort of on that and looking to that's obviously the basis in which it works on local connection generally. So that would be the approach. I should have just said, of course, I was talking about greenfield sites in terms of the 40%. Obviously, it would be 30% if it were brownfield, whether it was in the AONB or not. So yes, in essence, we fully agree that we are looking to spend the contributions locally. I wouldn't say necessarily in the AONB. If you're sort of Benenden way, which is on the edge, you'd look to spend it in Benenden, whether it's in the AONB or to that part just outside, rather than elsewhere in the AONB. But in essence, the principle that Ms Davis makes is one we fully agree with.
Okay, and just in terms of the policy requirement, then the rest of the policy requirement says based on 20% of the gross number of residential units to be provided greenfield land and 15% of the gross number of units to be provided on sites of the brownfield. So again, what's this based on? What are those figures based on? Is that viability assessment?
It is based on the Dixon Searle viability assessment. I haven't got the actual sort of assessment in front of me, but they certainly recommended the 20% maximum, and if you like, in the same way we have the 40, it's essentially half of the requirement from major sites, major in a development management sense, that is.
Yeah. Okay, we'll move on. So talk about the AONB sites. Question 4 within the matters, issues and questions was around first homes. And again, we've seen the council's statement. The thing for me there was about whether or not consideration should be given to an early update of plan or an early review and update of the plan. it's worthwhile the council just sort of setting out to other people around the virtual table what this issue is and whether or not they've considered updating the plan for where first homes are concerned.
Yes, sir. I'll come in, but Mr. Gardner is actually doing quite a bit of work for us on this. The council was thinking about whether to put it forward as a modification for people's benefit. Of course, the first homes has just been introduced to all intents and purposes, replacement for starter homes, and this has just come into effect, although it's actually operating from a development management point of view already. But the plan, because of the stage it had reached, is covered by transition arrangements, which means it doesn't have to make specific provision. But nevertheless, the council has considered it, as I say, in large part from a development management point of view, and the requirement is that 25% at least of all affordable housing would be first homes, and in essence, that is within the existing tenure split required by the policy, which looks at 60% rented and 40% of the tenures. So in essence, that 25% would form part of the 40%. We do already refer to first homes within the supporting text, although that might need just sort of updating because it refers to when first homes come forward in the future. But in essence, the council's view is it's already within the scope of the policy, and indeed the work that we've done so far suggests that it wouldn't be appropriate for us to depart from the in essence of the default requirements of in the legislation. So really for that reason, we don't think it is actually necessary to undertake an early review of the plan to accommodate this. To accommodate first home specifically. It's actually within the scope of the plan, and there's nothing regarding local circumstances that would mean the council would look to actually introduce bespoke conditions on the first homes over and above those covered by the national situation. I think, unless there's anything to add, Justin, I think that was that's where we are, sir.
Okay, we go to HBF, who's got some comments on this.
Thank you, sir. I just forgot how to work my video. It's Mark Barrett from the Home Builders Federation. Hear what the council is saying really with regard to that, and recognise that they are within the transition period in terms of local plan. But I think what the concern is that clearly they're looking to apply the policy as is, and I think it's just, if that's the case, then for clarity's sake, sir, it would seem appropriate to set that out within the plan if that is the intention and that is how it's being applied alongside the current policy. So I think it's just important that if it is that's how it's to apply, then that should be set out in policy to avoid confusion going forward, sir. If that amendment can be made, then it seems sensible to be made to the plan at present. So it's really just that point, sir. Recognise it's within transition, but actually the council seem to be applying it at the moment and don't look to be shifting away from national policy. So why not just set that out within the plan, sir?
Oh, that's wrong. But so is that something the council's looking to do, or is it something that the council's already doing then?
Sir, I don't think I'm not aware that that's been tested. I'll have to ask Mr. Hockney if we actually have had proposals for it, but certainly from a, of course, at the moment, we in the absence of the local plan, then applications can come forward and include first homes as part of them, and the need and viability information that we have suggests that we would be applying the sort of the national position. So I don't see any issue and just updating the text to say that this now embraces first homes within the sort of the text at paragraph 6.336. I think it appears earlier as well. Can't quite see it within the plan, just to say that yes, it embraces. Essentially, the policy embraces first homes. It's one of the options in terms of intermediate tenures that there are. I don't think we need to say any more than that.
So go back to Mr. Barrett then, HBF. Do you want to come back on that? I'll say council suggesting then it's 6.3.36. It refers to, appreciate it. It's not going to be a policy, it's not going to set it out, but the council seems to suggest that would, it says there could include first homes in the future under the sort of intermediate housing, etc. Do you think that's enough? Do you think it's going to work? There's going to be some confusion about this? What do you think the plan should do?
It's obviously in terms of what the council is saying with regard to things like the caps and the various different elements that you can choose. They're optional within the first homes. I think it's just really providing that clarity that they're looking to apply as set out by national policy, not looking to vary that. So I think it's that clarity, sir, that I was looking for. But appreciate that it's either that or set it out within saying the council will provide that necessary early review with regard to it. But it appears that it could be amended and provide a bit more clarity within the supporting text as is being suggested.
So would that be the council's preference over the setting out the requirements, carry out an early review and update of the plan then?
Yes, sir. What I'll do is think about some suitable wording and take the same approach with Mr. Barrett as I'm taking in relation to the issue of extra care.
Yeah, I agree. It can be, it's about clarity, isn't it? Clarity and effectiveness.
Yeah, essentially.
Okay, there's no more hands up, so we'll move on. So question 5 then, this refers to the requirements of providing affordable housing. Let me just go back to the policy. If I can find the policy again.
Part 3, sir.
It is, corner page. Yeah. Okay, H3, part 3, isn't it? Yeah, so timing of affordable housing on site. So a minimum of 50% of affordable housing is to be delivered on site, will be expected to be completed and transferred to the registered provider prior to occupation of 50% of the open market units. It's obviously that's quite directive and quite specific. So what's the justification for putting that in? And is it justified and will it be effective?
So I think the council sets this out in its hearing statement. In essence, it's to ensure the timely delivery of affordable housing. To make sure it's an integral part of the scheme, and particularly that it's actually delivered and not put back to the end of a scheme and then potentially put at risk. That's the basis of it. The assumption in the viability work was that it is done concurrently with the market housing. Therefore, what we're saying is, let's do it at least at the same time. I appreciate that circumstances can vary. In general, this has been operating. I put some examples in the hearing statement, albeit with slightly different percentages. And I think the council accepts that there may be some variation around the 50%, but nevertheless, it's to have you've been talking about minimum standards and sort of having some prescription. It's useful, I think, to have a sort of a clear policy presumption that if there is a justification, I don't think it should happen generally, because the affordable housing is normally sort of distributed within a development, that you set that presumption. If there is a very particular need to depart from it, that can be done at the development management stage. But it's really important, I think, to make this clear that it's built into developers' thinking at the very start, even at the stage of site purchase.
And just in terms of bigger strategic sites then that might be phased, especially around different phases for provision of infrastructure, etc. How will that work? Is it generally, how's that going to work for different phases? We heard from like Tudley Village, for example, and some of the work they've set out about different phases. Is this going to apply to every phase and every scheme coming forward, or just talk to me a bit more about how it would work for bigger strategic sites that be delivered in slightly different ways?
So I think I would, my assumption based on the policy was that it would apply to phases. Obviously, you're talking about probably quite significant phases, each of which would have affordable housing within it. But I think down to, if you on the specifics of Paddockwood and Tudley Village, I might ask Mr. Bourne to come in and advise on how that's being or how he sees that being carried forward.
Apologies, it took a little while to switch the camera and microphone on. So in broad terms, expectation that there will be mixed and balanced communities. There is, I think, a recognition of the need for some flexibility in relation to the strategic sites, and without going over again a lot of the matters that were discussed yesterday, the particular reference to the phasing, a phasing and delivery plan would assist in providing clarity in terms of proportions to be provided within phases and between phases, and ultimately the council, through the grant of planning permission and use of Section 106 agreements, would seek to establish that so that it can then be translated to delivery on site, with recognition that the build out, the infrastructure, etc., for the strategic sites is different perhaps to some of the other major sites elsewhere in the borough.
Ms. Ashton?
Thank you, sir. Really just to support what's just been said by the council, I think this probably can be dealt with through the phasing strategies that we discussed the other day, but perhaps also point 3 of Section 1 of Policy H3 also needs to be caveated, just to cross-refer to that as far as the strategic sites are concerned, or the strategic sites policy itself has to refer to it, so that the plan as a whole is clear as to what is being proposed within the strategic sites.
Yeah, I probably agree. There just needs to be a cross-reference, whether it's in H3 or the strategic sites themselves. We talked about modifications to the strategic site policies, talking about phasing and implementation plans, strategies, whatever they may be. So yeah, I leave it with the council to have a think about where it should naturally fit. But
my inclination is to think it should be in the strategic allocations, those policies themselves.
Yeah,
absolutely, sir.
Okay, we'll move on. So just the final question that I had under this, and then I'll sort of open it up to anybody else who wants to make comments, was just about the basis of the local connection, and we talked about that already under the context of the AONB. You talked about this sort of local connection cascade. So is that something that the council is doing at the moment? How does that work at the minute? Is this something that's continuation of sort of existing practice and development plan policy?
Yes, sir. In short, it is a continuation of existing practice. And yeah, it's summarised there, and it's yeah, I think we've set it out, and yes, it's I'm not aware of any issues in from a development management side of in operating this.
Okay, just in terms of one more point really on affordable housing, where schemes coming forward that maybe wouldn't meet the affordable housing requirements, and this is schemes put forward on viability. So you've got the policy there where it refers to exceptional circumstances, and what's the justification for setting out? Obviously, you've got, this is under policy H3, and it goes down to exceptional circumstances. Then you've got sort of 3-4 points, and then a sort of A, B, C, D, and E. So what was the sort of rationale and thinking behind having that much detail setting out, you know, when these sites may be appropriate? So this is sort of sites that aren't going to meet the full affordable housing requirements.
You're right, so it is quite a bit of detail, but the council thought it was necessary. There's been a lot of consideration by ourselves and our housing colleagues on this, and Mr. Bourne might want to come in, but I think it was considered important to give a clear indication on a sort of what can be a sort of a difficult area at times as to what to do, and particularly in terms of what the options are if the full policy requirements can't be achieved, in terms of do you look at reducing the provision, do you look at a different tenure mix? Those are quite important practical questions, which the council has sort of corporately given consideration to, and found a need and thought it was appropriate to set that out clearly in its policy. And as I say, this is something that I know members have been involved in the formulation of. So I think it is it looks at the practical issues. Obviously, we're not expecting it to be a regular occurrence, but where it does occur, it is appropriate to have a clear pathway for what happens essentially next.
And where it refers to these as exceptional circumstances, where the provision of on-site affordable housing is not viable. So is this all about viability then? Is there any consideration in the policy about particular set of circumstances where it may not be suitable or appropriate to provide affordable housing? Is that given any consideration in the policy?
Yeah, in essence, it's where, as the policy says, where full provision of on-site can't be achieved. So it's where it's proposed to be on-site and the full amount can't be achieved for viability reasons. It is a viability. It is a viability issue. So the general presumption, as set out so nationally, is that it is on-site rather than through financial contributions. But as you say, there may be circumstances, and I'm sure our friends at Provision would suggest that as well, where financial contributions may be more appropriate. I say particularly for elderly person schemes.
So
I think that would come down to an assessment through a development management process. I don't think it's a fixed position.
So just in terms, obviously, yeah, this is all about viability, isn't it? So this is the sort of developer coming forward and saying, here's the scheme, we can only viably provide 10% affordable housing or whatever. I was just wondering where the policy or where the plan, maybe it's somewhere else, reflected if it does other circumstances where it may be in locational terms perhaps more appropriate to have, say, financial contribution towards affordable housing than providing it on site. See, does crop up in development management. So just wondering how the council has maybe considered this in the past, or what policies they've used in the past to sort of consider these type of issues, whether it's been an issue, perhaps.
I'd have to defer to one of my colleagues. I'm not aware of the sort of personally of the sort of development management experience where it hasn't been achievable. To be honest, I've only ever come across that once in my own experience, where a development was right next to a very large, in this case, local authority affordable housing development, substantial development, where financial contributions to were appropriate. I think in the most case, in line with the MPPF, the presumption is for on-site. But I don't know if Mr. Bourne wants to, or Mr. Hockney wants to add to that.
Likewise, so in my experience, in around a decade at Tunbridge Wells, very, very limited circumstances where there has been a non-viability exception or circumstance considered. I think one of the points, and going back to what Mr. Marlowe mentioned earlier, has been, well, if it is if there is an exceptional circumstance case to be made on viability or otherwise, that clarity around how the sorts of preference, almost the sequential preference for how it should be provided, has been something which has been raised, which is why this has been included in the policy. The approach, I think, and again going back to Mr. Marlowe's point about the PPF being clear about on-site provision being what is expected. If there were to be another exceptional circumstance case put forward, the council, it would, as the policy is drafted, be contrary to that, but the council would, in reality, if it were to be accepted, I think use the sequential approach set out under the exceptional circumstances for viability, even if that isn't explicitly set out in the policy as worded.
Okay. Anybody, any other comments, questions, observations then on what we've heard so far, Mr. Jones?
Hello, sir. Yes, it's very interesting, but we've been listening. But just one point goes back to our initial point is, of course, it's nothing to do about viability. If you're extra care, our position is you are not then liable for provision of affordable housing, so you don't get into viability, and that's the critical issue. So we just really wanted to note that that's a critical issue, why the definition is so important. You don't enter the gateway, so we don't even look at viability if you're not within the conventional housing category. So that's a critical point that we're concerned about. Obviously Mrs. Miles has spoken about the flip-flopping of the council as to their attitude on C2 and C3 sites, which then are seeking to rely on sites that were not regarded as extra care as part of fulfilling that need. That's a separate issue, but our critical point is the plan has to be, cannot create confusion on that very distinct separate approach. No, thank you, sir.
Mr. Chapman. Sorry.
Yeah, hi, thank you, sir. Just wanted to ask for a bit of clarity on an issue. So at paragraph 6334, it says starter homes are identified in the NPPF as a type of affordable housing. However, the council is concerned that the applicable discount cannot be secured in perpetuity. Obviously, sort of the aim of the affordable housing policy is to provide sort of social rented and then sort of intermediate types, which are predominantly shared ownership here. But are the council suggesting that starter homes and first homes, which are replacing them, and also discounted market homes, which are in Annex 2, are they still allowable in the authority here? Because there seems to be. It seems to me that the only sort of mention of that type of thing comes in that paragraph, and there seems to be a concern about how that discount is secured in perpetuity. But having done one of those sites, I think the answer to this, and maybe this helps provide some clarity, is that you just add it into the title. So you put a restriction in the title that the whatever discount is provided in perpetuity. So it's tied with the land. So it's actually quite a simple way to deliver starter homes, first homes, and discount market sales. So just sort of trying to get a bit of clarity as to what the local authority's position is on that within the affordable housing policy. Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Marlowe.
Yeah, happy, sir. I'm not sure it's significant. Obviously, we mentioned starter homes because starter homes technically are there. They're still in the NPPF, and my recollection was that there wasn't a sort of an enduring sort of restriction on the discount, but they are in essence replaced by first homes, which, as Mr. Chapman says, there is essentially an enduring discount, and there can be through other mechanisms as well. As he says, it's a question of what can be done through the planning system as opposed to what can be done through by the actual promoter. So yes, those things we're not saying those things can't be done, but it just was a particular restriction of starter homes. Indeed, as part of our rethink, I'm not sure to what extent we actually need to continue to mention starter homes as they haven't really been carried forward. I don't know if you've got a view on that, sir.
Yeah, I think you should probably. That was the paragraph that you referred to before that Mr. Chapman was then just referring to as well, wasn't he? In the supporting text. Probably needs a bit of a flick through the supporting text, just in terms of sense checking, making sure that it is up to date, reflects national planning policy, and again the same advice as before. Less is more, really, sometimes, isn't it? In terms of these things, can appreciate why the council wants to set out detailed supporting text, but then these things change, don't they? And things can come out of date. So yeah, have a look at it. But I'd be happy to support any changes and made modifications that would bring the plan in line with the MPPF. Okay, any other questions on affordable housing? If not, we will take a break. We've only got a couple of issues of this morning's sessions left, so we'll finish in plenty of time for an early lunch break, but we will just take a comfort break. Should we just say sort of 15 minutes until 11:50? We'll have a tea and coffee break, we'll adjourn, and then we'll resume back at 11:50. Thank you. Okay, thank you, everyone. I think we've got everyone we need, so we'll make a start and continue. There's only really two sort of additional policies to go through in this morning's session, so we shouldn't be too much longer. The first one was around policy H4, estate regeneration. Is it worthwhile just to council explaining what the purpose of that policy is, and what it seeks to do, and whether or not it applies to any proposals in particular? Just a bit of a rationale and justification for the policy as a whole first.
Thank you, sir. So the borough has some areas within it, particularly in Tunbridge Wells, where there are areas of predominantly affordable housing. Some of those were constructed at a particular time, and the one in particular, the housing stock which is there has issues with it, and is likely to need replacing. There are others over the course of the plan period that could well come forward, and the council has had in relatively recent experience, relatively recent times, exactly this experience of estates or sizable areas of affordable housing coming forward for renewal. The council, having regard to the MPPF and the matters which were discussed in earlier sessions around the need for affordable housing in the borough, it supports the renewal and improvement of the housing stock and creation of well-designed places. And what it sets out in terms of its exact wording is that those proposals for estate regeneration will be supported. It sets out that the starting point should be no net loss of affordable housing, and that any loss of affordable housing must be justified only in exceptional circumstances, and they are listed within the policy itself. So there is the number of locations in the borough that this is likely to be applicable. It's recognised that is relatively limited. However, it's considered appropriate that, given the lifetime of the plan, to have a policy which allows for the assessment of proposals against this policy if/when they occur.
Okay, any questions, observations, representations on this from anybody then? No, I think it's very straightforward. That's what that's seeking to achieve. Okay, we'll move on then. I think finally, final point for discussion this morning was around rural exception sites, I believe, policy H5. I think CPRE, Ms. Davis, you'd made some representations, so I don't know whether it's worthwhile. Do you want to go straight into your representations on rural exception sites? That's policy H5.
You've caught me on the hop there. I wasn't planning to add anything other than was written in our hearing statements and previous representations. Okay, that's absolutely fine. So we'll just have a quick go through the policy then, and it's sort of fairly standards within that. One thing I just did want to pick up on was provision of market housing within rural exception sites. And this is your bullet point 5. Development would not normally contain any open market housing in exceptional circumstances and in accordance with the MPPF. Just quick, what did you mean by in accordance with the MPPF in that context? Sorry, can you just remind me where I'm looking?
Sorry.
Unprepared on this point.
No. Sorry, just policy H5 rural exception sites. And sorry, question for the council really. So under bullet point 5 on a rural exception site, it says that development would not normally contain any open market housing. In exceptional circumstances and in accordance with the NPPF, the inclusion within the scheme of a small proportion of open market housing may be considered acceptable in order to cross-subsidise the delivery of the affordable housing. Such proposals require submission of full viability assessments to demonstrate the market housing would only be built for enabling purposes. Enabling purposes would be strictly defined as allowing the affordable housing to be built with no extra profit being generated. It was just a bit in accordance with the NPPF. Was that just a general premise that the NPPF does allow for this rather than you're actually seeking anything else?
That's exactly it, sir. I think, and in a sense, you may say it's not necessary. I think previously the council took a very strict approach in terms of exception sites with no market housing. The policy is widened to allow for some in response to the NPPF. So, in essence, the wording of the criteria is an acknowledgement of that, but it is because, as you rightly say, the NPPF does allow for some market if it brings such sites forward, and that's all it means. It's I wouldn't disagree if you said it wasn't a necessary element of the criterion, but yes, that's all it means.
Okay, no, that's fine. Yeah, it falls into the category of is it unsound? You know, probably not. We're not here to sort of tidy up policies. It's just soundness issues. So no, that's absolutely fine. It's a point of clarity really for myself. The final part of this policy sets out some sort of specific requirements in terms of residential qualifications. So again, you've got lived in the parish or town continuously for the last 2 years or previously lived there. So again, just run me through what are they based on? Are these requirements that you've used previously? Have they been successful? Have there been any issues with them?
Yes, sir. They are used very widely. There haven't been too many in the way of rural exception sites, it has to be said, but they have been used, and they also, I think, reflect the council's general approach in terms of local connection as well. So yes, they certainly have been used, if not frequently, and I think they're fairly they're fairly normal criteria as well for rural exception sites, and I'm not aware of any representations really relating to those through the plan making process.
The NPPF defines rural exception sites, doesn't it, as small sites used for affordable housing. Does the plan give any reference to size? Talk about site be well related in scale and locations of settlement services. In the supporting text, whether it's rural exception sites are small housing sites. They'll only develop for housing that will remain affordable in perpetuity. So yeah, that's just taking the text directly from National Planning Policy, then, isn't it? Yeah, okay, that's absolutely fine. Okay, well, that was pretty straightforward. Anybody, any comments or observations on those two policies that we've heard there? Let's say this morning was primarily about affordable housing, really. But anything on what we've heard thus far? No. Probably good. Well, you'll all get a slightly longer lunch break today then than the last couple of days. Be pleased with that. Enjoy the nice weather. So this afternoon, I think there is again. Ordinarily, where it's the same people attending this afternoon, I'd rejig things, but I think there are people attending this afternoon. I think there's one lady in particular from some Visuals Access group who's down to attend this afternoon. So we'll resume on time at 2 o'clock. So just a reminder then, slightly longer lunch break. We'll resume at 2 o'clock. What I'll probably do, obviously, we'll talk about housing for older people first. We'll probably then talk about custom and self-build, and then we'll look at some of the other development management policies after that. But we'll resume at 2 o'clock. And just a note then for people, it is a separate link. So leave this meeting and then back in time for 2 o'clock for this afternoon session. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you all.